It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Mark Elvin, who I've known over the years in various capacities. And Mark, I always start by asking when and where a person is born. So
the historian's answer is very near here, Wilbraham. Well, nearly. I was born in Cambridge, but my first year and a half in life was spent there, but I don't remember it. All I remember are a few photographs, particularly of a pet lamb that I'm told I had, which got bigger much faster than I did and used to knock me down, so I would apparently fling myself onto the grass in front of the onset of this creature. But this is all hearsay. In a sense...
When was this?
38.
1938.
In a sense, the life I remember, if you like, the birth of consciousness, is in America, in San Francisco. It's a completely different environment. Because my father sent me and my mother, who was American, to live with my grandparents in San Francisco. And so I grew up until about the age of 6, I guess, almost 7, in California.
From what age? What age did you go there?
I would have gone there probably in 39, end of 39.
So you're about a year old.
A bit over a year. And my mother, who was a clinical psychologist, took a job in the juvenile court there, which in due course turned into the assignment from hell. She's amazingly calm and capable. And of course she only talked to me about it when I was about 25. But just after the Americans came into the war, an enormous number of troops poured through the Golden Gate and then out to the war with Japan. And the number of Lolita-aged girls who were in trouble was almost unhandleable. And my mother's job, which I knew nothing about as I played with my toy guns in the nursery, was to decide what should be done with these girls, some as young as 11, once the judicial process had had its way. And I never dreamt of what was going on. My chief sadness was when her legal clerk, a lady called Mary Caldwell, who was special to me because she had a gear shift in which an illuminated sailboat sailed across the knob, that was Marie, suddenly disappeared to sew ships with a welding gun in the shipyards in the north of the bay, organised by the automobile magnate Henry Kaiser. And she was no longer around. I didn't know much about what she was doing, but it was not confidential. I had no idea really what was going on at the time in the court, and I only had a rough idea of the war. I was taken around an aircraft carrier, for example, and my chief concern was for the poor rats who, I was told, I didn't see it happen, ran up the mooring hawsers, and then they reached one of these inverted coolie hats, couldn't turn around and fell off and got drowned. That upset my tender sensibilities. I had no idea what these young men were going off to do. Long afterwards I did.
Why were you presumably sent there because because of the war?
I was sent there because of the war, and my father was disappeared.
What was he doing?
The first 3 months he had what he said was, with a smile, the worst non-competent job in the government. He had to write the letters to the widows of those who had died in the Battle of Britain. He was in the Air Ministry. Because he put in tiny human touches, he was promptly, when this was discovered, taken off that job. And it was discovered he had 2 other abilities. One was a knowledge of America, so he became very much involved in relations with America, particularly trying to prepare a bit for the British public and the government for what would hope would be an alliance of some sort. Then the Japanese did his job for him. He wrote a temporary bestseller called Men of America, which was later on, after the war, translated into Japanese, interestingly. But the other was the one part he never talks about. My younger son has come to the conclusion that what was not spent in the Ministry of Information was mostly spent being the man behind the minister. At various conferences he had an extraordinary knowledge of the world, and which is why he later fitted so easily into Unesco. But that is the only bit where he, unlike I think many people, actually kept his mouth shut. He was garrulous, brilliant raconteur, but about this we never heard. Yeah, war is great for small boys, and they don't understand at that distance what's really going on. In San Francisco, I remember much later on, when coffee was rationed, there was a most bitter protest. You can put that into the British context and see why it seemed very odd when I look back afterwards. But, I mean, also, the impact at a personal level was that my grandfather, for example, was the minister of the first Unitarian church in San Francisco, had a very friendly old Japanese gentleman who looked after the church and was a great favourite of mine. I think I was a favourite of his. And then one day, as you will have anticipated, he disappeared into some kind of internment. And I never saw him again, and nobody would tell me where he'd gone, which even at that age worried me because I knew something was wrong. But it wasn't explained what the Americans were doing for security reasons. And he sort of then got engraved inside me just as a memory of something that went wrong. But otherwise it was a very straightforward childhood with some odd lessons in it. I don't want to go on too long about this.
Well, do,
phase.
Because you've written a 3-volume children's book.
Yes, but not with these things in it. I'll take just one that I never quite... I'll give you two. One nice and one a bit nasty and one a bit nice that will counterbalance, I hope. Both of these were at preschools or proto-kindergartens. The first, they wanted, I understood, to introduce something a bit more realistic into what we did. So I was presented when I got there, I'm guessing I'm 4, maybe 5, but probably 4, with a can with water in it and a 4-inch paintbrush, and told to paint the wooden slat fence outside in the sunshine. So I set to work and I carefully painted the wood with water. By the time I got to the second, or probably the third slat, it was drying off. So I went in and protested. I was told not to be silly, and that made me very angry. In fact, the row became so bad that my mother had to be called, and she managed diplomatically to settle it, and I was never asked to do such a silly thing again. But this, of course, in retrospect, was a wonderful parable for the real world, and much work. But that occurred later. But I never forgot that, because I began to learn that grown-ups could be incredibly stupid. And that was one of the first cases I remember where the grown-ups seemed to me to be being incredibly stupid and not backing down. Now, the nice story was I had another preschool school, a sort of general teacher, but mostly an art teacher called Miss Sunny. That really was at least the name she travelled under, and it suited her very well. And I did trees and houses and all the usual things, and children and animals. Not very well, but I did them. But I always did the sky, as I gather many kids do, as a solid line of blue across the top of the paper. And after a while she said, John, I was called John then. I changed my name later. Or rather, I used my second name later. If you look at the sky, doesn't it all come down and fill in all the gaps between the leaves and the roofs and things? And I said, maybe. He said, why don't you try doing it like that? And then I looked and I said, I paint the sky at the top because that is where it is. And now she didn't lose her temper. She just smiled and she said, that's fine by me, but give it a try sometime if you are interested. Well, sometime later I did, and I confessed that she was right. And she remained a great favourite of mine because she was a reasonable grown-up. She was helpful. She didn't bully, but she told me something. And after a while I thought about it and decided that I would also do sky that filled up all the little gaps. So that perhaps is enough about that, though I can talk probably till you go to sleep about life there. The chief point about it, of course, is the contrast with Britain after the war when I came back. In fact, I came back slightly before the war was over in a meat steamer, which many British children travelled in at some point or other, called the Rangatiki, New Zealand meat steamer, which travelled in the centre of the convoy for protection against the U-boats. I don't know why my father brought us back quite so early, though he was very aware that the war was going to end in our favour, but it hadn't yet ended in our favour.
About 44, was it?
Yeah. And at any rate, I suffered a terrible pang of guilt for my behaviour there, because I made a very beautiful little paper boat and brightly coloured, and was caught by the steward dropping it over the side of the boat. And he gave me a terrible, really I realised he was deadly serious talking to. He said, if you leave that in the water floating around, the Germans will see it, and they'll know we've been going by. I put the rubbish into a weighted container every evening, and I drop it over the side of the boat, and it goes straight to the bottom where nobody can see it. He said, don't you ever do that again, because you're risking people's lives. And I thought, oh my God. Now this again was because he described things. This was a reasonable grown-up, and I was desperately anxious that we would not be attacked because of my paper boat bobbing up and down on the waves. I took it very seriously. I don't know how serious it was in one incident, but the logic was perfectly clear. And he hadn't tried to punish me, he just gave me a heck of a warning. And why? So folks understood, and I behaved extremely well afterwards.
I want to now take you back a bit. People sometimes, you mentioned one set of grandparents, but are there any other ancestors or grandparents who are important for you? Not
really, apart from my other grandparents and some uncles, a couple of uncles, very important. But at that point I only knew my mother's father, who was a bit overawing. Saturdays you had to observe complete silence in the house because he was writing his sermon. It's a familiar problem, I think, that children of the manse have, but at any rate, I really related much better to my grandmother. I was in awe of the grandfather, but my grandmother, who was distantly related, she told us, and she was very truthful, though we've never made it certain, as a Wright from Ohio to the Wrights who had invented powered flight. It looks as if they could have been a somewhat removed cousin, but Diane, who's a genealogist, has not yet pinned that down. I think the family, understandably, is a little bit unhappy. She respects this about too much poking around. But at any rate, she was interested in, above all, birds and vegetables. And I grew a vegetable garden under her supervision. First vegetables I grew, which must have been 4. I grew chard and radishes and then various other things that were. And looked at the birds in the garden. We occasionally had hummingbirds. I remember watching a hummingbird flying backwards. It wasn't common, but it did happen. And thinking, oh, something extraordinary. She was a good cook. What I didn't know, and only learned this year, was that my grandfather had been a minister too, unfaithful to her during a transatlantic holiday voyage to go to some conference or other in Europe with his church organist. And suddenly I discovered I had a sort of cousin, Tom Stone.
Are you happy for this to go on the web?
Yeah,
well,
absolutely happy.
Yeah.
Wonderful guy who wrote to me with all the details, which had only been just recently released to him because the older ladies in the family who did know this and kept it deadly secret decided that since his father, who would have been very hurt by it, had died, they would now tell his son. So suddenly I discovered that I wasn't, as it were, on my own, and we've been in correspondence since then. But my grandfather was a very moral and authoritarian chap, and this would of course have smashed his career to pieces. It was kept quiet, but I'm quite certain in retrospect that my grandmother knew. There was a kind of subdued sadness about her which impressed me very early on, and I didn't know why. She found relief in the birds and marvellous little Californian bird like the ruby-crowned kinglet. I mean, incredible. Imagine a wren with a red crown on. And so that now, for the first time in 70 years plus, makes sense. Now, where did you want to go from there?
Well,
I could take various tracks.
What about the other grandparents?
Well, okay, that fits in with the uncles too.
Yeah.
My father's father was a lay preacher. I always had understood Methodist, but actually I think it is Congregationalist. I think there was a misinformation. But he was a lay preacher. He was rather rigid, but a very principled man, and I think in this case genuinely. And he was a trade union leader. Had some rather interesting stories about trade unionism, saying his hardest job as a leader of the clerks' union had been to organise the offices of the railway unions personnel. Unions running the railways workforce, or in charge of their
interests, in England,
did not want to have their clerks in their offices unionised, and it was quite a struggle. He, in the end, became a member of the London County Council. He became, at least for 1 year, the president of the TUC, the Trade Union Congress. So there's a very deep streak, which didn't die in me either, which regards trade unions responsibly run as incredibly important parts of society, and particularly not the big events, but the endless day-to-day, patient, largely confidential battle against the mistreatment of people who are workers. And also a very real sense that, I should add, that if the business or office is not flourishing, then it's not to the good of the people who work there. It was a very balanced and cautious and thoughtful man. My grandmother was tiny. My father's mother was tiny. I should call Dolly. She was probably about 4'11". And it turned out later on that she was in fact a free thinker, but had kept her mouth shut while my grandfather was alive. But something of her attitude clearly got into my father and his two brothers. My grandfather died fairly young, by 67. Perhaps not young for those days, but compared to the others who all died in their 80s, he died young. And I remember knowing he was going to die by looking at him when he sort of sat in a chair having Benja's food and had a shawl around his shoulders. It didn't look good. But he was, in fact, a very remarkable man, and I must have inherited something of his attitude towards society. There were my grandmother, as I say, I can only perhaps sum up her character, but about the only time in her and my life, and she lost her temper with me, it was very near the end. She was living at that time, Leon C, in my second uncle's house, and I didn't like to be, even then, early 80s, thought of as a burden. And I went in full of righteousness when staying there, and did all the washing up after for lunch and breakfast. I was just finishing when she came in and gave me a tremendous scolding. I thought, have I washed it up wrong? Is it not properly rinsed? I thought I was trained. Then she calmed down and explained. She said, I am living here, she said, simply on the effect of the charity of Uncle George and Aunt Peg, and there's very little left that I can still do. But washing up is the one thing I can do, and you've got to let me do it. And I suddenly had awe-stricken respect for this self-discipline, and I apologised at once, and of course she forgave me. But there was a burst of real anger which I'd actually never seen. Quite incredible at the age of, 82 or 3. She died 84. And so she was a character, but I didn't know her very deeply, unlike my American grandmother. My two uncles are interesting people. Uncle George was the de facto, not de jure, founder of the old Associated Cinematograph and Television Technicians Union, the ACTTU, which for a time had extremely powerful control over the manufacture, production and showing of films made in Britain. He was a man who exuded willpower the way a boxer exudes strength. He went eye to eye with people like Spiros Skouras, and I don't know with Sam Goldwyn, certainly his representatives. He took on power, and he very often won. He was a very determined guy, with a wonderful sense of humour, but he suffered a lot from the nervous strain. But the sense of humour was what he is remembered for, I think. I'll give you just two sort of examples, one light-hearted, one rather fascinating. He always took bribes. He always accepted any bribe he was offered. He immediately declared what he'd received on the big notice board in the main union office in Soho Square. You know, one fur coat. He then circularised his deputies around all the branches, saying, which of your members would have a use for this? So if somebody wrote in and said, well, George, you know, so-and-so's just died and his widow's, you know, would, I think, love a new fur coat. George would look carefully around, ring up, see if he'd missed anybody, and then he'd send the fur coat off with the compliments of the union. He took every bribe, he declared every bribe, it never went to him personally, ever. And the other thing was that he was attacked by one of the Sunday papers, which I don't know if it's still around. I have a vague memory that it was called the Sunday Pictorial. If that's still in existence, please don't accept this as anything more than a hazy memory. But what happened afterwards is more than a memory. He was accused of being a card-carrying communist. He was very left-wing. He was not a communist. And he sued them. And he won a lot of money. What did he do with that money? That's where the humour comes in. He took a very well-publicised trip to Sochi on the Black Sea in the old Soviet Union and had a very deluxe holiday and brought back a lot of caviar and vodka and other things with him for the family. I know, because that's my first taste of caviar, both kinds. And he was just rubbing it in that he wasn't going to be intimidated by this kind of behaviour. He was a great character. I suppose I also got when I lived in Glasgow much later, an insight into his methods of negotiating, because he'd come up for some meeting in Glasgow and we'd arranged to go and pick him up, bring him back, give him a bed. Well, I probably picked him up around midnight, a bit later maybe even, and the meeting had finished. He seemed to be quite extraordinarily drunk. I won't give on tape an imitation, but it really was burp and slurp and wobble. Well, he came back and we sat him down and gave him a coffee. And then, of course, we got somehow onto the one real disagreement that my wife, then wife, and I had with him. We thought the world of him as a person, but we did think that his union, which was later on changed his policy, but not under his leadership, towards people who made small budget films, particularly in arts, anthropology and the sciences, did not get a fair deal. They did not need to have a special electrician for putting the plug in and out, and many other rules that the ACT demanded. And somehow we got into this, and then where was my drunken uncle? Once the arguments got going, suddenly he began to sit up. The slur left his voice. He leant slightly forward on his elbow, and he was talking lucidly, like a trade union negotiator should, and disagreeing with every word. We believed what we said was true, and we agreed to differ, but I realised that the secret of his technique was to feign drunkenness with a tremendously hard head and stay absolutely stony sober inside. It was an extraordinary lesson. His humour? Well, I once, in the context...
Mark, we'll have to move on, I think.
Can
probably.
I tell one anecdote?
One anecdote.
I mean, I can go forever, as you know, but but the humour was of this sort, that he was being attacked by us again, politely but firmly, for not looking after small budget artistic and scientific filmmakers, when he said, "Mark, we are reasonable people." I said, "Uncle George, come on. If we were making feature film or a documentary for commercial display in British cinemas of the ascent of Everest. We are by union rules required to have 2 of our technicians on the summit. And he leant forward and said, we would be reasonable. We wouldn't insist on more than 1. Well, that was the kind of rough-hewn guy it was. I did some negotiating in Australia later on in my life, not at a very high level compared to that, but that was a useful model. Now,
let's get to your parents.
You like my parents next?
Tell me something about their
look,
character.
I must tell you about my other uncle.
Okay, quickly.
Very quickly. If this story is true, well, I can only say that it was told to me as if it were. If the Foreign Office rings you up and says wrong, you can say I apologise. But the story is as follows. He got trapped in the Soviet Union when the Second World War when Hitler developed a second front. And he went straight to the embassy, where my grandfather did know the ambassador, and he was given the job as second assistant night watchman at the embassy. Okay, he was very happy with this. And then there was the embassy chess tournament. Now, 2 points. My uncle was not a great chess player, but he was not half bad. I was a better player, but he was not hopeless by any means. Then the Soviet Union and Great Britain arranged over the radio chess matches, and it was necessary to have Russian-speaking, at least one representative in the room to see who followed the rules, who also knew chess. And at that point there was a problem. Nobody to go. But there had just previously been a British embassy chess tournament. It probably had moved at this point just to Sverdlovsk, actually, the embassy. At any rate, embarrassingly for the diplomats, my uncle won. Now, you cannot have your assistant night watchman thrashing top political secretaries in the embassy. It just isn't done, or wasn't done. And so the ambassador suddenly saw the way to solve both problems. He summoned my uncle and said, Elvin, sir, you play chess, yes. You speak Russian? Badly, sir. What's your past experience? Well, I used to work as a floor manager for Alexander Korda, later Sir Alexander Korda. Okay, he said, you've got a job now. Firstly, promotion, however. You are now the assistant secretary for culture. Uncle sort of didn't believe his ears. And you are going to look after the refereeing and umpiring relationships with the forthcoming radio chess match. And so he did. I don't believe there is any comparable promotion in the history of the British diplomatic service, which, if that's true, can match it. I only had it from him, and he knew all the top Russian players, Latvianik, Bronstein, so forth. He knew them because he worked with them. So there was a foundation of something there. Well, this was a man who brought a Russian ballerina, Violetta Prokhorova, better known as Mark Elvin, back to Britain after the war. How did he do it? It's now been confirmed by her. She now lives in Naples. She's married somebody else later on and is now widowed. That it was a direct intervention of Attlee at my grandfather's request with Stalin. That's how you get a top ballerina out of Russia to marry her. Probably no other way possible. So he was in his own way a very interesting man. I won't talk longer about him, but there are many, many stories which always touch on the edge of the unbelievable and then turn out to have something that is correct. Now you wanted to move on.
Your parents, tell me their character and how that might have influenced.
Well, my father was always a man I greatly respected, was always very proper and careful and cautious and responsible. For example, he and my mother never travelled on the same aeroplane until I was 21, so I would never be a total orphan. I only found that out later. But not seeing him, except for a very brief visit during the war, meant that I reached the age of 7, without knowing him. I knew he was there. So my bonding was very much with my mother, who was quite different. My mother was an extraordinary person and went in very deep indeed. I always respected my father, but he was not, on the surface, ever interested in what I did. He was working firstly at higher education as the principal of Ruskin College in Oxford, when Oxford actually asked him if he wanted Ruskin to be incorporated into the university, something I don't think happened, or could have happened later. and he talked about it with the people there and decided against it. But in his day at Ruskin, people like Bertrand Russell and Joseph Needham would come willingly to talk publicly, and the place would be full of people from the main university at Ruskin College. A very remarkable man. But with me, his relations are summed up by when I'd done a painting or I'd written something and I'd show it to him, he'd look at it briefly and say, "Very fine." Later on, I got in the habit of embarrassing him by saying, "Would you look at this? But please don't say it's very fine." So he found other things to say. But he nonetheless said some equivalent of very fine. He wasn't really interested, at least on the surface. Then he went to Unesco, as the E in Unesco, in the days when it was still a remarkable idealistic organisation, not a way of finding jobs for people who owed political debts in too many other countries. And that meant we had to go and live in Paris, and I saw a little bit more of him there, but mostly I just remembered his table talk, which was brilliant. But he had very little interaction with me, even so, although he was very responsible and very kind in a rather distant way. My mother was quite a different matter. My mother was certainly the first woman to get a first in psychology at Cambridge, just a second degree. She had Stanford before that. She was one of the especially gifted children studied by Terman at Stanford throughout the rest of their lives. The project carried on until very recently. She was the scientific part of my background, and although she was basically in therapeutic work, her great speciality being the effects after the war of localized lesions in the brain, in which she was, for a very long time after Richie Russell, with whom she worked, regarded as the most important person to refer to. And she was part of the team that first put agrammatism on the screen, shall we say, as a real phenomenon with tests to determine its presence. Agrammatism, of course, means having a vocabulary, maybe even quite a large one, several thousand words, but not being able to string them together in a reliable and consistent order. Not even inventing your own sequences, but having a kind of random mixture of perfectly meaningful syllables, or perfectly meaningful words, I should say, but no consistent structure. I think the last time I talked to her, she said there were probably about 4 cases a year in Britain, if that, mostly motorcyclists. But during the war, there was a great number of these people, and she spent most of her years before we moved to Paris, and some of her time after she came back, we came back, trying to find out, above all, how to diagnose the specifics, because the agrammatism can come in very different patterns and degrees, and try to work out and help find some kind of useful employment for such people. So I gained from her a very acute awareness of the importance of science in society, and eventually, as a historian, I turned more and more to saying the great gap in history are people who can bring together the proper skills of a social scientist, anthropologist and social historian on the one hand, and some sense of the science, because there are plenty of histories of science written for scientists about the great steps and so forth, and there are histories of a social nature, but there is not enough of a meeting ground in the middle, and not enough people working, as I was to, in history primarily, actually could understand some of it. Well, I was from her that, and I was often her that I gained a sense of its importance, and I was for quite a while, in our time at Oxford, in the late 40s, an occupant of the Institute of Experimental Psychology, now been demolished and I think largely replaced by the engineering building, as one of the first people on whom a new test or a new piece of machinery, a tachistoscope of a new kind and did new things, would be tested. So I was very familiar with what was going on in these places, as it were, as a laboratory rat that happened to be human.
Were you the only child?
I was an only child, which was basically Hitler's fault.
Hmm.
I did beg my mother to have a brother or sister, She said, even if we did, she said, and I think there was a lot of financial pressure at first, which made it difficult, would have made it difficult, and she had also a professional job to do, you would not actually be that child's brother or sister, you'd be a junior uncle. Because by then you'd probably be 12, 11 or 12 or whatever it was. And I forget the age when she told me this, and she said, really, it doesn't. You've lost it, in effect. It wouldn't make sense.
You've talked about her professional abilities, but in her relationship to you, was she warm and... Fantastic.
But we didn't really even need that, because we got... When you have an only parent and an only child, in the sense if it works, it works to the point where really you don't have a problem. I mean, I never quarrelled with my parents ever, basically. I mean, differences of opinion, at least after a very early age with my father, because it just didn't seem appropriate. That probably was helped by being at a boarding school the later part, because going to my parents for 1/3 of the year, mostly in Paris when I got older, was like having a fantastic holiday. But the relationships were extremely easy, and she was interested in what I did, and she was good for intelligent conversation to within a very... until the last time I saw her. I didn't quite get back from Australia in time to be present in hospital when she died. I missed it by about 24 hours. But apparently she was completely lucid even as she was going under, and turned to a lady called Joyce, who'd been an enormous help in the house when my father was ill, and just apparently her last words were completely lucid and blunt. Joyce, look after Lionel, please. And Joyce did. She's gone now, but she was fantastic. But she even when her body was falling apart, the lucidity and willpower were quite, and yet it was not harsh, it was gentle willpower, were quite striking. I remember going to see her once near the end when I'd come to visit from Australia, and she was like a glove puppet. There was a head that was working, and there was a body that hung a bit like a limp glove puppet's flexible body. Oh God. Then I looked in her eyes, and they came straight back. And I thought, she's good for a bit of time yet. She sometimes took 2 hours to dress properly in the morning, because it was very slow and painful, but she would not move until she'd done a good job. She always did. She had a remarkable willpower. She kept being re-employed. Every time she retired from a hospital job, there'd be a phone call. I was every time, I lost 3 times. And she was still working at 78, 79, when the team she was with broke up, and she didn't go back. But what's interesting about that is that it wasn't just the team breaking up. She decided, looking at herself very clinically, that her eyesight wasn't good enough to drive home in the dark from the New Addenbrooke's hospital where she worked. So she said, okay, that is over. I'm not safe on the roads at night. I can still drive in the daylight, but not in the dark. And so she's in effect just dismissed herself after talking to people.
That's
typical.
Yeah, she sounds lovely, but yeah. I'm afraid we'll have to hurry on quickly, because we're
I'm sorry, you
well
must,
into our time.
I think, Alan, you must pick a few topics, and I'll give
well, I'm just going to keep moving on, but can we now move on to I mean, you return when you're about 4 or 5, 6, but let's skip straight to the Dragon School, if you don't mind, if that's okay. I mean, we were both at the Dragon School, but I was there later than you, so whatever you would like to say about your experience there.
Well, I think that from the point of view of the topic that you're interested in, which is, if you like, the formation of a somewhat personal worldview or way of going about things, was there that it really dawned on me that I was different, because I come back from California. It was quite a long way ahead of Britain in some respects. Ahead must carry quotation marks. But I found people doing things, engaging things very, very differently. And I was extremely rebellious and utterly unpersuadable. You've heard in private stories, which I won't repeat now. There's no reason why they shouldn't be repeated, but I got beaten a lot and regarded this as just ridiculous. I carried it off and got great peer group adulation, which only made me behave badly again. I was very bright, which is the reason they tolerated me. If I think I've been in their place, I'd have asked me to be removed. And in the end, I only stopped behaving because exactly what Jock Lynham, the acting headmaster, the real headmaster, did when I said, "Oh, you don't mean that, sir." So I do mean it, Elvin.
That's expelling you.
Expelling me, yes. Well, after that I behaved, more or less. But internally and mentally I didn't behave. But it went from physical misbehaviour, which I didn't really have much trouble in stopping. Some appalling stories. I never believed that I would lose an argument when I took it on. If I took on an argument and I was beaten, I accepted that with the masters. But if I was right, I never changed. And I remember the extraordinary bewilderment of Wilding, a very good classics teacher, that I remembered an argument we'd had for a year, and I came back at him when there was an opportunity and said, "I still don't see why." He beat me again, and then he gave in. I don't think children that remember arguments in detail for a year are commonplace, even though there's some very brilliant people there. I dug in, and that was me, I dug in. But I would yield to an argument. And the thing that was most interesting, though, was that I accepted that these people knew maths beyond what I could ever hope to understand, classics beyond what I could perhaps hope to understand, but not for a long time yet, and many other things which I had a great deal to learn and did very happily, but not religion. Well, exposed to a variety of religions, and none, because both my parents were quite agnostics. They were not in any sense atheists, in a digressive sense at all, not Dawkins. I mean, my mother, when I asked her about it, just said, "Mark," she said, I changed my name to Mark by then, my second name. It's just not intellectually responsible to believe in a revealed religion. And that sums her up. It wasn't a great sort of agony or a great triumph. Neither. It just wasn't intellectually responsible. And that tells you a lot about her attitude. And she could talk in detail if you wanted to, but I knew what she meant. But I was fascinated at the dragon. Well, I would normally expect totally to be overwhelmed in anything like maths or classics. I could usually, with my friend Francis Hope, were very important, the two of us, aided and abetted each other. Sorry, slow down. I had a very good friend who later on died in the Orly air crash. She was a very bright and remarkable person whom we'd had enormous hopes for the future, Francis Hope, but who got killed there. So we both had this point of view, and we tended to help each other out and back each other up and so forth. But I was amazed by the fact that the one area where I would normally, or rather I should say we, would virtually always win was on religion and philosophical issues related to religion, and I was genuinely interested. I wasn't trying to do anything demonic or satanic. That would have horrified me. But I was puzzled by the fact that I was told nonsense. Other masters might be perhaps wrong or have something I didn't agree with, but nonsense, no. This was nonsense. And this contrast fascinated me. So I was already, by the age of 11, in some ways you could say, someone who took as his guide Bertrand Russell's work that was accessible to me, beginning with Unpopular Essays. And I suppose that meant that my sense of being an outsider, of always being at odds with an establishment which is not the one I'd grown up with, which is very important, was very deeply anchored. And going to France, where people had different values again, and being there on the vacation, I spoke not bilingual but totally adequate, fluent, operational French by that time. Merely rubbed it in. I mean, to take a totally trivial, familiar example, but one which was one of the first that hit me, so I shall claim a certain right of experience to mention it, was drinking soup. In France, you of course tip the plate away from you, and you move the spoon from you, away from you. In Britain, you normally do the opposite. I think I've got it right. No, it's the other way. It's the way around. Britain, it's away, and France is towards you. You see, and I remember being baffled by this. And then it just seemed to me to be the way that the world was. In different places, different people did different things. And so nobody was necessarily right. I remember much later on I came across a phrase that Wittgenstein had. I've forgotten the exact German, so I'll say it in English. All could also be otherwise. I said, but of course, it usually is too. So this, again, I suppose, laid the foundation, I'm guessing here, of two things. Firstly, an interest in China, where they certainly did do things very otherwise, it seemed, when I first got interested in it. And also for a view that normally if I picked up a secondary work on a subject that I knew something about, it was bound to be at least partly wrong. That was a working assumption. Indeed, later on in working in history, my normal procedure, when I knew a little tiny bit about something that I want to look at, was to look at sources first. Look at sources first, and then when you've got a working idea, try it out against a secondary work. Sometimes secondary work stood up, but not always. At any rate, the general assumption was that one would find always something new, because mostly adults were not known by childhood for always talking good sense. Sounds very arrogant. It wasn't meant to be. It was the result of being bumped in various ways by circumstance in West Coast America, post-war Britain, and diplomatic France, because my father was an international civil servant, moving largely among diplomats and people of similar sort.
So that's excellent. Just a couple of more things on the dragon. One was that where you started playing chess seriously?
I don't know when I started playing chess seriously, but it must have been by the time I was 7, because quite early on, because my father, until he stopped being able to move behind the table, could always beat me even as an adult at ping pong. He was a very tough competitor indeed, and wily. I began to beat him regularly at chess when I was 7, and he refused thereafter to play with me. I played with my uncle, the one that was in Russia, into my mid-teens, but I still beat him fairly easily. Until late at night, his technique was a bit different from my father's. He'd keep me up till 3 or 4 in the morning until finally I either lost my concentration or, in the end, perhaps let him win a game. But he wasn't bad. I was better, but he wasn't bad. But my father, one of the few things I thought my father was a bit weak on, was when he just refused thereafter to play chess with me. So by 7 I must have been beginning to get somewhere. I don't know how. We had a chess team that was formed by a master called Denison Smith, who was...
Yes, Denny Whiff.
Denny Whiff, I don't like that name. I thought he was very good value. And that chess team did extremely well.
Won all the competitions.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was very proud to be on that team.
What about other things at the Dragon? Did you play any games or sing or act or anything? I
was bad. I would have loved to have acted. My friend Francis Hope was brilliant. I think the only boy there to carry off Hamlet under Bruno's guidance. And for me, that's still a normative Hamlet. But I had some minor part. I think I was Voltaire man, one of the ambassadors, about 2 lines. And that was typical. I get single 2 or 3 line parts. I would have loved to have been able to act. For some reason, I couldn't. I was not musical in the ordinary sense, but that's for very special reasons. My mother was too sensitive to music. I repeat, it wasn't she was not musical, she was too sensitive. She'd had Beethoven forced on her by her father, and she wanted nothing less than to be exposed close up to a Brandenburg or Beethoven. It got at her, it took her over, she hated it. So I picked this up by a kind of, almost one could say non-scientifically, but telepathy. And so I largely turned off music until I was probably about 12. When belatedly we discovered it. I have an extraordinarily Catholic taste in music, but there's absolutely nothing, virtually nothing to Dragon whatsoever, and a little bit to one master at St. Paul's. But basically to just trying on my own to regain the world of music. And my mother was very, very unhappy about her effect on me. She was well aware of it, but she would nobly, in the early days, come to concerts with me. But I could sense her effort, willpower. She sat there, trying not to let it get at her. So in the end, when I was a little older, I went by myself. This had the effect of opening me, though, to music all at the same time. So whether I was listening to Guillaume de Machaut or Anton Webern, let alone on the classics, it was all music to me. And I took it as equal and on its own terms. And when I went to Cambridge, of course, I immediately joined the Cambridge Asian Music Circle under that neo-genius Lawrence Picken, a man who could play 70 instruments, virtually all of them non-British. And again, I took on music, particularly actually Indian classical music. It's simply just another music. I mean, I helped organise in a modest way the concert for Ravi Shankar and Chatterlal, the tabla player, that Lawrence put on in my first year at Cambridge. And, you know, this became another example of, in a sense, taking all cultures sort of on their own terms. I don't think all musics are equal by any means. But after having discovered, first I discovered Webern, with the R and the N, not just the R, Anton. And secondly, discovering Hindustani classical music. We're just part of this process and remain, you know, very deep inside me even now, though I don't listen to a great deal of music, except perhaps naughtily as a background to work when I'm feeling a bit depressed. It works marvellously. For that, nothing much stronger than Shostakovich. If I go stronger than that, I have to stop and listen to it properly. So I darned well should, but don't in every case. But again, it's another example of this curious destruction of the normal structure of growing up.
That's fascinating. Just finally on the Dragon, you were presumably ended up in class 1, top class.
Everything. Except the special calculus group taken by a former first wrangler, which I wasn't good enough for.
Well, who was that?
Wilhelm Meister. He was called Willy Meister, and that sounds as if I'm thinking of something else. But
Gerald Meister. His real name was.
Anyhow, he was an old man, very clever, and the sort of 4 or 5 kids who could, you know, do calculus went off and studied with him. However, I was strong in one thing, geometry. I won geometry prizes. You'd come from the bottom of A1 in maths to win prizes in deductive geometry, because I've got a very strong visual sense linked with chess, and I liked it. The other aspects of it I struggled, like I don't like to say. I always wanted to know math. I always was fascinated by maths. I was no, forgive the colloquialism, I was no bloody good at it. And so I remember trying to work out what one would do if one dropped the 5th postulate of Euclid. Parallel lines never meet unless defines them. I remember trying to work out, must have been the age of 12, maybe just 13, trying to work out what that would mean, and being told by a very kind and very firm and completely correct maths master Wilkie that I should wait till later to look at that. But it symbolises my confusions, that I found maths fascinating but impossible, and I kept on trying to make a dent on it. But never got. I mean, I'm calculus. I can do simple calculus and have been for ages. But I mean, it didn't come naturally.
But all the other subjects you were top of?
No, no means. I was probably about in the area of 5th or 6th in classics. There were people like John Dunbabin and Luke Hodgkin around, and they were better than I was at classics. Francis Hope and I interchanged history and English. He tended to win more English tops. I tended to win more history, but we both were at some time at the top, one or the other in that. French, I really could, but after I left the Dragon, if I'd been doing French there at 14, I think I would have had no trouble sweeping the board. Though Francis was also very good at it. No, maths, I normally came bottom or bottom but 1 in the form of 16, unless they had geometry, where I'm quite capable of coming top for some totally weird reason. Later on in life, I found mathematical logic, this is a bedrock proto-maths, fascinating too. And it meant that when I tried to learn to write computer programs, I took a manual onto my boat in the Thames and spent a long weekend and came back and wrote programs that worked. It was Algol 68R. That was just an odd feature, that little bit of my brain could do maths, the rest wasn't up to it.
Did you win a scholarship or a...
Oh yes, I got a scholarship to St Paul's, but I actually came 16th on the roll at Eton, because I wanted to go to Eton because my best friend was going there, and did. But I missed it by one place. Actually, with all apologies to Eton, the best event in my life, because I ended up by getting superlative teaching in history and in French at St Paul's. And I also was able to go every weekend to the British Museum in London, which I did.
Tell me a little about St Paul's. What was good about it, apart from these teachers?
The best teachers were extremely good.
Who were they?
There were a teacher called Frank Snow, who was sort of the junior of the top two teachers of history, and he wasn't bad. He challenged us to write a long essay through the first term, and I wrote mine on water in world history. And I certainly think the fact that I later on have worked a great deal on the history of water, particularly in China, must have owed something to what I learned by doing that. But the most important person was Philip Whitting. Whitting was a Byzantinist who was already an established figure in the field of Byzantine numismatics and coinage history, and on the board of several journals. He was an absolute professional. He was extremely good. I learned an enormous amount from him, and regarded him as essentially an oracle. But even so, one to be argued with, but with extraordinary respect. No, that was amazing, and it was probably because of his Byzantinism that at the age of 15 I read every volume, I'm not sure I quite finished, of Roger of Sicily, of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I read it mostly while travelling on the Underground, but going to games and other things, but also in gaps. I got through every volume, and that gave me a vision of history, which is very unusual to these days. It shouldn't be. But I can mentally, automatically, link the ancient world to the medieval world, down to the modern world, without any sense of shifting gears. There's a continuous movement. I wrote my first important book, The Pattern of the Chinese Past, ultimately off a template, a time template, which was derived from reading Gibbon.
Very interesting.
It's very, very important, and that was Whitting's doing. He is acknowledged very handsomely in the book, and rightly so. So the other was the teacher of French, always known informally as Toby Parker. Not that we would ever have dreamt of calling him that to his face. Very, very interesting teacher who was, on the surface, a ferocious martinet. Your pen had to be in exactly the right place in front of you on the desk. I mean, exactly. Your eyes had to be on him as he talked, or you were in trouble. When I knew him much better, and he'd relaxed a great deal, I realised from what he said that he'd worked this out regretfully, because he'd begun life as a very soft master who was pushed around by the boys. So, being a very bright and determined man, he'd worked out a bullying technique that was carefully relaxed as people became fit to be talked to as human beings, in his view. He was a brilliant language teacher, and he was also on Harrop's Dictionary Committee. In other words, in the French teacher and the history teacher, I had two of the most extraordinary people who were certainly at academic level of a university in their skills. And I mean, that was extraordinarily important. But I got a scholarship to Cambridge when I was 16, and only just 16.
Gosh.
Because of the high pressure, fascinating teaching I got from these two people.